Hello, welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Bible Study. Today's study will focus on chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians. That chapter is directly linked story flow with chapter 9, basically the same topic and a continuation of one into the other. The collection for the poor in Jerusalem is essentially the topic that's being discussed. Several scholars point out that in Paul's letters, we only see this term collection from Paul's Gentile church viewpoint, and that we need to appreciate that based on evidence elsewhere, that this idea was not Paul's idea, that this came about by the apostles in general, and was being done by other than just Gentile churches. But the activities we read here would almost imply that the only people doing this were Paul's churches. The Corinthians had previously committed to making this collection, but had waned in their support for it once they became estranged from Paul. And therefore, part of what's going on here is to trying to rejuvenate that. I will not read chapter 8. It's fairly long, and moreover, many scholars say that especially teaching scholars say what's more important here is to kind of get the story on the page, because Paul has written this with the assumption that they know that the reader knows all this, because he's not writing to us, he's writing to the Corinthians, who he's made aware of all these issues. And so I'm going to spend my time following the advice of several teaching scholars, and that is fill in the story flow of this collection process so that we, as we study it on our own, we have a better understanding of what Paul is talking about here. And another point is that Eugene Boring, a disciple scholar at Bright Divinity, says, don't confuse this with advice on tithes and offerings. This is not about tithes and offerings. This is specifically about a specific collection that was being taken up for the poor in Jerusalem, specifically the Palestinian Christians that are there. Paul refers to this collection by many names, and only here does he use the Greek word meaning collection. Usually he makes the point it is for the poor or for the saints in Jerusalem. It appears the idea for this collection came about in a meeting of the apostles, as mentioned in Acts, and detailed in quite some detail in the book of Galatians. In Galatians, Paul acknowledges that he, Barnabas, and Titus had gone to Jerusalem for a conference with some of the other apostles, but they may have all been there, we don't know. We do know from what's said, James, John, Peter were there. Of course, that's the three big ones. And so, and that they're there to address issues that Paul's ministry to the Gentiles has caused to develop in the new movement we call Christianity. It created some issues in the faith that needed to be addressed by the whole faith and not just by Paul. For example, one issue was, and we need to understand this faith emerged out of Judaism, was buried within Judaism for quite some time. And so one issue that came out of this was that Paul had not insisted on his converts becoming Jewish proselytes first before accepting this new faith. And especially, as an example, not being circumcised as a right of entering into the people of God, and therefore being under the covenant or the old covenant. Titus, for example, had not been circumcised, and thus was a true Gentile Christian in their presence. So he's there with the apostles. And the other apostles would have required normally no one be in that circle unless they were circumcised. While Paul and Barnabas were Jewish converts, also they're Jews, been in the Jewish faith, and have now converted to Christianity, and are there for what we call Jewish Christians. And that would be the Jewish Christians are the type people that this collection is being made for, who are back in Palestine under strong Roman persecution as far as ability to make money and that sort of thing. So therefore the need for these people to be cared for in some ways. This issue was sensitive and required a paradigm shift for which Paul debates. That is, this issue of circumcision, this issue of becoming Jewish, entering Christianity, if you will, by first coming to the Jewish faith. So Paul has already had this paradigm shift. He's thought it through because he was a staunch Jew, persecuted the church initially because he thought it was the wrong way. And once his mind was changed, he's on a very different path. And so he argues for these apostles to understand the situation. Paul indicates they accepted his arguments, and they did not compel Titus to be circumcised on the spot. The apostles agreed for a more aggressive than Gentile mission, that is missionary work, if you will, and assigned Paul and Barnabas to that task. And Paul makes the point somewhere there in his writings, not here in chapter 8, that he was on equal footing then with the pillars of the faith being those apostles in Jerusalem and the originally disciples of Jesus, whereas Paul definitely was not a disciple of Jesus, that is, the earthly Jesus. In Galatians, Paul reports that these pillars of the faith only requested that Paul and Barnabas, in their process of doing this missionary work, still help take care of the circumcised and remember the poor, meaning those who are Jewish Christians back in Palestine or outside of the more well-known Roman territories and Greek territories. Scholars say that was in reference to the Jewish Christian congregation in Palestine. Most of them say they don't think he's talking about care. The reminder here is to care for those Jewish Christians within Paul's individual churches, but it's the specific people back there in Palestine. Paul says he was eager to comply and agreed with the concept. Paul seems to see their faith, that is, his people's faith, and the faith of the Jewish Christians as both gifts from God and neither Greek or Jew. This is a unified faith, and therefore there is oneness, and they shouldn't think of it as Greek or Jew. They're believers is what follow the term Christians has not come about yet. That at least it's not found in Paul's writings. He refers to them as believers, and it is that aim that Paul teaches in Corinth, that we are unified faith. This gift is not just that you're giving, is an idea some scholars say, that gift that he's going to ask, that he's asking these people to collect for these poor people, is not just money, but it's fellowship among Christian believers. Scholars say it appears that Paul had not asked or expected the church at Macedonia, which much of chapter 8 deals with. The churches in Macedonia, there are several of them, but the two most well-known will be the church at Thessalonica and Philippi. To participate, but they learned of it and wanted to be included on their own initiative, and have already made their collection. And that's a point that you don't necessarily pick up fully, that scholars say, no, you need to appreciate in chapter 8 that Macedonians already made the collection. They're not in the process, it's already done. They're ready to go. And the plan is for that delegation from Macedonia, where Paul is currently located, to arrive with Paul in Corinth on their way to Jerusalem. That was the original plan that was developed. Such could create quite an embarrassing situation for both Paul and the Corinthians if the Macedonians arrived with their collection before the Corinthians had even taken theirs up. Part of that problem is that the Corinthians and the Macedonians are very competitive towards one another in lots of other areas. They appear to have, these Corinthians appear to have been very strongly on board initially, but waned substantially after the estrangement with Paul. And so part of what's happening in chapter 8, Paul appears to be trying to increase their enthusiasm for this collection by pointing out the enthusiasm that's in Macedonia. Corinth is a much wealthier community, however, than the Macedonians. So the other issue that's brought up here is the fact these people have gone beyond their means with this collection. They weren't even asked by Paul, apparently, to make the collection. They have made it anyway, and even more, sort of seems like they've even more than stretched themselves. And part of the reason for this, the fact that this community is poor, is Macedonia is still under very strong Roman oppression at this time. Unlike the Corinthians, which went through a similar thing 100 years before, they have had time to recover. They're still being oppressed quite strongly in Macedonia. After all, that was the home state, if you will, of Alexander the Great, and those people didn't take to Roman rule as fast as the Corinthians did. Paul sees this collection as much more than relief to the poor. Several scholars say that he seems to also think of it as a symbol from the Gentiles to acknowledge their indebtedness to the Jewish or Jerusalem Christians and the Jews in general for founding this faith. Moreover, the Greco-Roman culture of that time had a strong belief, sociologists say, of what was called gift reciprocation for benefits that they had incurred for services that were really performed earlier, and they're now still benefiting from it. That it was considered to give gifts in reciprocation for those kind of services, that it both was appropriate and a necessary part of your moral character. Thus, the type and response the Macedonians has made fits that standard. And sociologists especially think this is a big part of the timing and fact that Macedonia did not want to be left out of it. They felt obligated by their own culture, their historical culture, to respond, since they were benefiting from these Jerusalem Christians' activity. Macedonia is supporting Paul's mission while the Corinthians are lingering, is basically the story in chapter 8. So Paul may also be, and then he's using them also possibly to casting them, the Macedonians, as an example of the way it should be done in the heart as well as physically done. They have the right idea and the right mindset, even if they didn't have the funds. They have excelled beyond Paul's expectations in showing love for the ministry, and Paul takes this personally, that they're doing this also to support his ministry. They want to make him look good, so to speak. So Paul is also linking his ministry and its success with how successful the collection is. However, some scholars see Paul reporting here on these Macedonians to the Corinthians as trying to really stir up competition because of the strong competitiveness those two societies had in their gymnastic physical activities and some histories of war and so forth. Or even maybe, and some scholars argue, he's shaming them, using it as shameful, but most scholars don't go that far. He appeals to these Corinthians by pointing out how these poor, he didn't use these words, but they're saying when you look at the sociology of it and the situation, he's using these poor low-class Macedonians in the mindset of a Corinthian as having exceeded all expectations, while the Corinthians have been sitting idle, and they are a very wealthy society in proportion. The Macedonians are both your cooperators at times, and they're your competition. Paul also seems to believe that those with abundance are obligated to help those in need, and the Corinthians are known for their wealth, while the Macedonians are mostly poor and under strong persecution by the Romans. They clearly are an example that Paul thinks should be emulated. And as one scholar then sticks in there, and outdone. It appears Titus has played a key role in Macedonia. Thus Paul, at the end of chapter 8, he spends a good bit of time with the accolades of Titus. Thus Paul will send him back to Corinth now to try to influence the collection there. Also with him are two brothers. And these are brothers in the faith. They're not biological. There's no other mention of these, or nor is there ability to deduce it from the rest of Paul's writing. So we don't know who these people are, except it appears that they're being placed there as administrative stewards or something of that sort. And so that Paul will not be accused of somehow mishandling the money. So that appears to be, and so he's letting these Corinthians know that that's who these people are. They're not his. That Paul's not going to handle the money. Eugene Bourne and Fred Craddock in their writings on 2 Corinthians say these gifts have the grace of God connected to them, and he opens that chapter with that term, and they tend to build around that. The message is that Paul's ministry is the result of the grace of God. The faith is the result of that. That is, they are given, it was given in gratitude, and therefore in gratitude to those who didn't earn. And so likewise, the gifts you give to those in need, because the need is there. It's not an earned idea. This is not a competition per se, but it is an opportunity to emulate the nature of God, the grace of God, by these fellow Christians. This is what Christianity is about, Boring says. Christianity is not about self-interest. The life, the ministry, and the death of Jesus on earth stands as an example of the suffering servant to others, and that should not be forgotten by Christians. The Macedonian sacrifice for others have given beyond their ability almost, because of their faith in Christ. They are emulating Christ's example of the suffering servant by giving of themselves. And then there's a line that fits more or less this in Paul's writing there. Because giving oneself to God is to give oneself to other people's needs. And to address others' needs is to give oneself to God. That's the story that the scholars say is here and that Paul is building chapter 8 around. Hope you find this information helpful as you study chapter 8, and we hope to see you next week.